As you settle into your bed and draw the covers closer around you, allow your body to relax. Let your eyes grow heavy and imagine the slow, quiet rhythms of a world long before your time. Picture the soft hum of the earth itself, the faint vibration of rock and water, a planet turning in silence under distant suns. In these moments, your mind can drift gently through vast stretches of time to an era when life itself hovered on the brink of disappearance. What would it mean for the earth to nearly become lifeless, to see its oceans empty of movement, its skies stripped of color, its lands barren and unyielding? Long before humans walked across continents, before forests drew their first breath of wind, the planet itself endured cycles of extremes that tested every form of nascent life. The story of these ages is written not in words, but in stone, in chemical signatures locked deep in sediments, in the whisper of minerals that record fire, ice, and the slow transformations of oceans and atmosphere. The earliest eons of Earth's existence, known as the Hadean and Archean, stretch back more than 4 billion years. During these times, the planet's surface was a chaotic mosaic of molten rock, cooling crust, and violent volcanic activity. Giant impacts from asteroids and comets shaped continents and ocean basins, while heat from radioactive decay kept much of the interior in flux. Water existed in vapor, in scattered pools, or possibly in thin oceans, forming between episodes of intense meteor bombardment. The first atmosphere was thick with gases released from eruptions, rich in carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and traces of methane and ammonia. A world far from the oxygen-rich skies that life would one day require. Amid this turbulent environment, microscopic life began to emerge. Cyanobacteria and other simple microorganisms appeared in shallow waters, harvesting energy from chemical reactions and sunlight. Their metabolic processes gradually transformed the chemistry of the oceans and the thin atmosphere, slowly accumulating oxygen in a process that would eventually culminate in the Great Oxidation Event. This shift did not occur without consequences. Rising oxygen levels created toxic conditions for organisms adapted to low oxygen environments, and large portions of early microbial life faced near extinction. During this time, Earth experienced some of its most extreme climatic events, episodes now described as Snowball Earth glaciations. Evidence from glacial deposits scattered across continents, banded iron formations, and isotopic ratios indicate that for millions of years, ice may have encased the planet from equator to poles. Global temperatures plunged, and sunlight reaching the oceans became a mere fraction of what it had been. Only microorganisms dwelling near hydrothermal vents or in thin layers beneath sea ice survived these inhospitable conditions. These bottlenecks compressed evolutionary opportunities, favoring only the most adaptable and resilient life forms. Volcanic activity, however, persisted beneath the frozen crust, releasing greenhouse gases that slowly warmed the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide and methane accumulated, triggering cycles of melting and refreezing, creating an unsteady balance between ice-covered and thawed periods. These feedback mechanisms highlight the fragility of the planetary climate system, where even slight variations in gas concentrations could shift the balance between habitability and near-total lifelessness. Each volcanic eruption, each chemical fluctuation carried the potential to either doom life or provide a fleeting sanctuary for survival. Ocean chemistry played a critical role in these eras. Oxygen-poor waters expanded in some regions, while sulfur concentrations increased, creating anoxic zones inhospitable to most organisms. Microbes adapted to extreme chemical conditions thrived in these refuges, maintaining the threads of life. Shallow marine environments occasionally became oxygenated during melting phases, allowing bursts of productivity and offering opportunities for evolutionary experimentation. Life teetered between extinction and expansion in cycles dictated by the delicate interplay of geology, chemistry, and climate. By the late Precambrian, around 800 to 600 million years ago, these extreme events had sculpted both the biosphere and the planet itself. Supercontinents such as Rodinia influenced ocean currents, redistributing heat and altering climate patterns. The breakup of these landmasses, combined with volcanic emissions and glacial feedbacks, gradually stabilized environmental conditions. Oxygen levels rose steadily, paving the way for the emergence of eukaryotic cells, organisms with complex internal structures capable of greater metabolic versatility. The groundwork for multicellular life was laid in the careful preservation of ecosystems that had weathered repeated environmental extremes. Through each glaciation and chemical upheaval, Earth demonstrated a remarkable capacity for recovery. Microbial life adapted, survived in isolated niches, and slowly diversified. The planet teetered on the edge of lifelessness multiple times, yet the combination of geological dynamism, chemical shifts, and biological resilience maintained a fragile equilibrium. These epochs remind us that habitability is neither guaranteed nor static, but a product of interconnected systems operating over vast spans of time. Within the ice-bound oceans and fractured shallow seas, life clung to existence in unexpected places. Microorganisms occupied niches that would seem hostile by any modern standard. Beneath thick layers of ice, in pockets of liquid water heated by geothermal activity, or sheltered within mineral-rich sediments at the ocean floor. Hydrothermal vents provided a constant source of energy, releasing hydrogen sulfide and other chemicals that microbes could metabolize. These vents, though isolated, became crucibles of resilience, supporting communities that endured while surface waters froze or became anoxic. In some cases, microbial mats developed in shallow pools, warmed by volcanic heat, creating temporary oases where photosynthesis could continue despite pervasive cold and darkness. The chemical composition of the oceans influenced survival in subtle but profound ways. Periodic glacial melting carried minerals and nutrients from eroding rocks into the seas, fueling blooms of microbial life in localized zones. Variations in sulfur, iron, and phosphorus concentrations dictated which organisms thrived and which perished. Cyanobacteria, for example, could exploit thin layers of sunlight under ice, producing oxygen in small amounts that slowly accumulated in isolated pockets. This patchwork of habitability illustrates how life persisted, not through uniform abundance, but through scattered, fragile refuges where environmental extremes were slightly mitigated. As the ice sheets receded and returned to partial melting phases, the interplay between rising temperatures and chemical shifts created a selective pressure that favored adaptability. Microbial life forms with flexible metabolic pathways were more likely to survive and reproduce, gradually seeding oceans with organisms capable of enduring fluctuations in oxygen, temperature, and nutrient availability. Some of these organisms carried symbiotic partners, a prelude to endosymbiotic events that would later give rise to eukaryotic cells. The slow accumulation of genetic complexity in these microorganisms set the stage for future evolutionary breakthroughs, even as the planet's surface remained hostile and largely uninhabitable for large-scale life. Geological processes continued to shape these environments, creating transient habitats and influencing ocean circulation. Tectonic shifts fragmented continents, forming shallow seas, basins, and inland lakes that experienced variable exposure to sunlight and warmth. In combination with melting glacial runoff, these areas acted as incubators of biological experimentation. Microbes capable of exploiting fluctuating conditions thrived, while less adaptable populations dwindled. Each environmental fluctuation was both a challenge and an opportunity, emphasizing that survival depended on more than mere endurance. It required the capacity to respond dynamically to a planet in near constant upheaval. Over millions of years, these cycles of freezing, thawing, chemical flux, and tectonic activity gradually moderated. Greenhouse gases released by volcanism and decaying organic matter warmed pockets of the atmosphere, tempering extremes and allowing more continuous habitation of shallow marine zones. Oxygen concentrations in the oceans slowly increased, creating conditions that permitted eukaryotic cells to emerge and persist. These cells, with internal membranes and organelles, could extract energy more efficiently, survive varied chemical conditions, and establish symbiotic relationships that further enhanced resilience. The emergence of eukaryotes marked a turning point, representing both biological innovation and the cumulative result of survival through the harshest conditions. The late Precambrian period witnessed the subtle transformation of ecosystems from simple, isolated microbial communities into interconnected networks. Oxygenation events, though gradual, provided the chemical framework for metabolic diversification. Life that had survived in hydrothermal vents, icebound pools, and anoxic basins now had access to wider habitats as climates stabilized and nutrient cycles normalized. Fossil evidence from this time reveals diverse forms of multicellular life, including early sponges and algae, suggesting that even amid past near-extinction events, the seeds of complex ecosystems were quietly taking root. These discoveries illustrate how Earth's resilience is as much a product of persistent biological ingenuity as it is of geological moderation. The interplay of ice, ocean chemistry, volcanic activity, and continental drift demonstrates that life's persistence during these nearly lifeless eras was never a simple process. Each factor influenced the others in an intricate, dynamic system. Glacial coverage affected ocean salinity and nutrient distribution. Tectonic shifts reshaped currents and heat flows. Volcanic gases altered atmospheric chemistry, and microbial communities responded continuously to these fluctuations. No single aspect determined survival, yet together they created a precarious balance in which life could endure. The Earth of these times was a world of extremes, yet it contained hidden zones of stability where the persistence of life was quietly ensured. As the eons passed, the Earth's surface gradually transitioned from the frozen and tumultuous conditions of the Snowball Earth periods to more stable environments. The shifting of tectonic plates played a decisive role in this transformation. Supercontinents, such as Rodinia, began to fragment, creating extensive coastlines, shallow seas, and continental shelves that offered new habitats for life. The breakup of massive landmasses not only reshaped the physical geography, but also influenced ocean currents, which redistributed heat and nutrients across the planet. These currents carried warmer waters to higher latitudes and replenished oxygen and essential minerals in previously stagnant regions, gradually creating a mosaic of habitable zones where life could persist and diversify. The chemistry of the oceans continued to evolve alongside these geological changes. Oxygen levels rose incrementally, punctuated by localized anoxic episodes, creating opportunities for metabolic innovation among microorganisms. Sulfur, iron, and phosphorus concentrations fluctuated with volcanic activity, glacial runoff, and continental weathering, dictating which communities thrived in specific regions. Microbes adapted to these variations, developing metabolic flexibility that allowed them to survive intermittent stresses. The presence of refugia, hydrothermal vents, shallow warm pools, and isolated nutrient-rich zones ensured that even during periods of global stress, pockets of life endured, quietly laying the groundwork for later complexity. During this time, eukaryotic organisms began to flourish in these newly moderated environments. With internal organelles and more efficient energy production, they could survive in a broader range of conditions than simpler prokaryotes. Some engaged in symbiotic relationships, combining capabilities in ways that conferred increased resilience to environmental fluctuations. These cellular innovations gradually allowed life to explore new forms and scales, eventually giving rise to multicellular structures capable of greater specialization and environmental adaptation. The late Precambrian oceans were dynamic arenas of experimentation. Shallow epicontinental seas formed between drifting continental fragments, providing relatively stable light and nutrient conditions for photosynthetic organisms. These waters became hotbeds of microbial activity, driving localized oxygenation events that further increased the habitability of surrounding environments. Cyanobacteria continued to play a critical role, producing oxygen that altered local chemistry and promoted diversification. The interplay between these biological and geological processes reinforced the planet's slow recovery from the extreme conditions that had nearly eradicated life. Climate stability improved gradually as greenhouse gas levels stabilized. Carbon dioxide and methane, once highly variable, reached more balanced concentrations due to volcanic emissions, chemical weathering of continental rocks, and biological uptake by photosynthetic organisms. The atmosphere became more hospitable, supporting a broader range of metabolic strategies and enabling organisms to colonize areas previously inhospitable due to extreme cold or chemical imbalance. The Earth's recovery, while slow, illustrates the profound interdependence between life and planetary systems. Without resilient microorganisms, oxygenation would not have progressed. Without geophysical processes, refuge for survival would have been far less extensive. As life slowly diversified in these calmer seas, sedimentation patterns preserved a record of this transformation. Fossils of multicellular organisms trace evidence of movement, and chemical signatures in carbonate deposits reveal a gradual increase in complexity. These late Precambrian ecosystems, though modest by later standards, reflect the planet's cautious return to biological productivity. Life, once pushed to the edge, began to expand into a wider variety of habitats, demonstrating both the fragility and the persistence of early ecosystems. The Earth of this era remained a planet profoundly shaped by its near brushes with lifelessness. Each glacial episode Each chemical fluctuation, each tectonic shift had exerted pressures that tested the limits of survival. Yet these challenges had also driven adaptation, innovation, and diversification. Microbial life, eukaryotic cells, and the first multicellular organisms collectively bore witness to the quiet tenacity that allowed life to endure, setting the stage for the subsequent Cambrian explosion that would populate the oceans with an unprecedented variety of forms. In the gradually stabilizing oceans, microbial communities demonstrated remarkable adaptability. Life persisted in regions where nutrient concentrations fluctuated, oxygen was unevenly distributed, and temperatures varied across short distances. Microorganisms developed specialized metabolic pathways to exploit these variations. Some could switch between aerobic and anaerobic respiration, depending on local oxygen levels, while others relied on sulfur or nitrogen compounds as alternative energy sources. This metabolic flexibility allowed life to maintain continuity, even as environmental conditions shifted unpredictably, ensuring that the foundations for later multicellular life remained intact. Ocean atmosphere feedback loops became critical in regulating the planet's recovery. Carbon dioxide and methane, released episodically from volcanic eruptions and seafloor vents, influenced global temperatures, while photosynthetic activity gradually drew down atmospheric carbon levels. Cyanobacteria and early algae in shallow seas converted sunlight and carbon dioxide into oxygen, slowly altering both the chemistry of the oceans and the composition of the atmosphere. In turn, these changes affected climate patterns, ice cover, and ocean circulation, creating a complex system of interdependent processes where biological activity directly influenced planetary conditions. The interplay between glacial cycles and volcanic activity shaped the distribution of life across continents and oceans. When ice sheets advanced, shallow marine habitats shrank, concentrating life in narrow refuges where competition and adaptation intensified. Volcanic eruptions released nutrients and greenhouse gases that temporarily warmed these regions, allowing microbial blooms to expand into newly available habitats. These cycles, repeated over millions of years, created strong selective pressures favoring organisms that could survive extreme cold, variable oxygen levels, and fluctuating nutrient availability. As a result, microbial lineages with greater flexibility proliferated, preserving the genetic diversity essential for future evolutionary developments. The chemistry of late Precambrian oceans reflected both the legacy of near-extinction events and the gradual recovery of ecosystems. Oxygen concentrations were rising, but remained patchy, creating stratified water columns with oxic layers above and anoxic zones below. Iron, phosphorus, and sulfur levels varied spatially and temporally, influencing which organisms dominated particular niches. Microbial mats formed dense colonies in shallow waters, producing oxygen that diffused slowly into surrounding regions. In deeper or enclosed basins, anoxic conditions persisted, allowing anaerobic microbes to thrive. This mosaic of habitats ensured that life could survive globally, even if local conditions were temporarily inhospitable. Geological processes further amplified the diversity of available niches. Continental fragments created shallow seas, fjords, and inland basins, while tectonic uplifts and erosion transported minerals into the oceans. Hydrothermal vent systems continued to provide heat and chemical energy, serving as stable refuges during periods of environmental stress. Each localized habitat became a stage for evolutionary experimentation, where microbial communities could refine metabolic strategies, develop symbiotic relationships, and gradually increase cellular complexity. These isolated experiments, repeated across vast temporal and spatial scales, underpinned the eventual emergence of more sophisticated life forms. By the close of the late Precambrian, the cumulative effects of these processes had established a more resilient biosphere. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere and oceans reached thresholds that could support multicellular organisms, while shallow seas and continental margins offered relatively stable conditions for ecological expansion. Microbial lineages that had survived repeated bottlenecks now formed the foundation for emerging eukaryotic diversity. These organisms, capable of forming colonies and simple multicellular structures, exploited the range of environmental conditions, from oxygenated shallow waters to nutrient-rich sediments, expanding life into territories once nearly uninhabitable. The planet, once at the edge of lifelessness, demonstrated a profound capacity for recovery. Feedback between microbial activity and global chemistry, coupled with geological and climatic processes, created a dynamic yet stable environment where life could persist and diversify. Each surviving population, each chemical cycle, each tectonic adjustment contributed to the delicate balance that allowed the biosphere to endure. Life's persistence was neither sudden nor guaranteed. It was the outcome of countless interactions, adaptations, and recoveries over millions of years, quietly reshaping the Earth into a world capable of sustaining complexity. As the late Precambrian unfolded, the first signs of multicellular organization began to appear. Simple colonies of cells formed in nutrient-rich coastal and shallow marine environments, allowing organisms to occupy ecological niches inaccessible to solitary microbes. These multicellular forms exhibited division of labor at a basic level, with some cells specialized for nutrient absorption, others for structural support, and still others for movement or light capture. Although rudimentary, these innovations allowed life to expand both spatially and functionally, gradually transforming previously sparse microbial mats into increasingly complex communities. The stabilization of environmental conditions played a critical role in this transformation. Oxygen concentrations reached levels sufficient to support higher metabolic rates, permitting cells to grow larger and sustain cooperative interactions. Nutrient cycles became more predictable as glaciers retreated and sediments enriched the oceans, creating zones where multicellular forms could thrive without immediate threat of oxygen depletion or extreme temperature shifts. Repeated glacial advances and retreats, while still challenging, had diminished in intensity, allowing habitats to persist for longer periods and facilitating evolutionary continuity. These nascent ecosystems displayed remarkable heterogeneity. Shallow seas harbored densely packed microbial mats overlaid with colonies of early multicellular organisms. Deeper basins remained dominated by anoxic microbial communities, preserving a reservoir of diversity that could recolonize newly habitable areas. Hydrothermal vent communities, isolated yet enduring, maintained metabolic strategies that had existed for billions of years, providing both genetic continuity and ecological stability. The interaction of these different environments created a patchwork biosphere in which life could experiment with new forms and strategies without risking total collapse. Geological activity continued to influence the distribution and diversity of life. Tectonic rearrangements altered coastlines, creating embayments, lagoons, and shallow continental shelves. These features provided both protection from strong currents and access to sunlight, essential for photosynthetic organisms. Volcanic eruptions delivered minerals that enriched waters, sparking localized growth of microbial and multicellular colonies. Ocean currents, influenced by the configuration of continents, circulated nutrients and oxygen, linking previously isolated habitats and promoting genetic exchange between populations. These connections increased ecological complexity and set the stage for evolutionary innovation. The biochemical environment of late Precambrian oceans also facilitated multicellular development. Oxygen-rich surface waters allowed aerobic metabolism to dominate, while deeper anoxic zones continued to support anaerobic organisms. The contrast between these layers created environmental gradients that selected for organisms capable of tolerating a range of conditions. Some eukaryotic cells began forming simple extracellular matrices, providing structural cohesion and enabling rudimentary tissue-like organization. In this way, environmental pressures, chemical stratification, and biological innovation converge to produce life forms capable of sustained growth and cooperation. By the final stages of the late Precambrian, Earth's biosphere had emerged from a series of near-catastrophic events to a state of measured stability. The delicate balance of oxygen levels, nutrient availability, climate moderation, and geological dynamism had allowed life not only to survive, but to prepare for a major expansion of complexity. Microbial mats, simple multicellular colonies, and resilient eukaryotic lineages now coexisted, interacting within an intricate web of chemical and ecological feedbacks. The planet had transitioned from the brink of lifelessness to a thriving, though still modest, biosphere, capable of supporting increasingly sophisticated forms of life in the millennia to come. These developments illustrate the profound interdependence between life and its environment. Microbes and eukaryotes influenced the composition of the oceans and atmosphere, while geological and climatic forces shaped the distribution and success of populations. The survival of life through the extreme conditions of the Snowball Earth periods, through chemical instability, and through repeated environmental stress underscores a central truth. The persistence of life depends not on a single factor, but on the continuous interplay of countless processes acting over immense spans of time. Within these late Precambrian seas, multicellular life began to develop more specialized forms. Simple colonies evolved structures that provided both protection and efficiency, creating the first rudimentary divisions of labor within organisms. Some cells developed the ability to anchor colonies to substrates, stabilizing populations in regions of steady currents, while others specialized in capturing light or absorbing dissolved nutrients. These early innovations, though small, marked a significant increase in functional complexity, allowing organisms to exploit habitats more effectively and to compete successfully in a recovering but still challenging environment. The interplay between physical geography and biological activity became increasingly pronounced. As continental fragments drifted and shallow seas expanded, life colonized new areas with a range of environmental conditions. Currents transported nutrients and oxygen across regions, creating zones of higher productivity interspersed with marginally habitable areas. Microbial mats and simple multicellular colonies thrived in these conditions, adapting to local chemical gradients, fluctuating temperatures, and intermittent glacial influences. The variability of these environments promoted genetic diversification, producing a broader repertoire of survival strategies that would underpin future evolutionary advancements. Chemical stratification in the oceans continued to influence ecosystem development. Surface waters, enriched in oxygen through photosynthetic activity, supported aerobic organisms capable of higher metabolic rates and growth. Deeper, anoxic layers retained communities of anaerobic microbes, preserving ancient metabolic pathways that had persisted through Snowball Earth and other extreme events. The juxtaposition of these layers created ecological gradients that encourage specialization, fostering organisms capable of tolerating multiple conditions and ultimately promoting interactions between previously isolated populations. Refugees in marginal and extreme environments remained vital to survival. Hydrothermal vent communities persisted as stable centers of metabolic activity, supplying heat and chemically rich fluids that sustained life even when surface conditions were variable. Shallow lagoons and sheltered bays offered protection from strong currents, providing habitats where early multicellular colonies could maintain structural integrity and reproductive success. Life in these refuges contributed disproportionately to the gradual recolonization of more exposed regions as conditions stabilized, illustrating the importance of isolated, resilient habitats in sustaining the biosphere through repeated environmental stress. Interactions between life and the geochemical environment intensified. Oxygen produced by photosynthetic organisms gradually altered sediment chemistry, precipitating minerals and influencing nutrient cycles. Microbial decomposition in sediments released carbon and nitrogen compounds, maintaining a dynamic chemical balance that supported further growth and diversification. Volcanic inputs supplied essential minerals, while the movement of continents and associated changes in ocean circulation redistributed these resources. In this way, the planet's physical and chemical systems remained intimately linked with the evolutionary trajectory of life, each influencing the other over millions of years. By the final stages of the late Precambrian, ecosystems had become more structured and interconnected. Multicellular colonies exhibited spatial organization. Microbial mats formed layered communities with chemical differentiation, and interactions between organisms shaped local and regional environmental conditions. Life had moved beyond mere survival. It was beginning to influence the very habitats it occupied, establishing feedback loops that reinforced stability and encouraged further complexity. The Earth, once nearly lifeless, now hosted a mosaic of productive, interdependent ecosystems, a testament to the resilience and adaptability of life over geological timescales. The gradual accumulation of these adaptations set the stage for the Cambrian explosion, a period in which multicellular life would diversify dramatically. Though still modest in scale compared to later periods, the late Precambrian biosphere had emerged from cycles of glaciation, chemical fluctuation, and tectonic upheaval to a state capable of sustaining more complex life forms. The interplay between microbial innovation, environmental stabilization, and ecological structuring illustrates how Earth navigated the delicate balance between lifelessness and flourishing, ensuring that life not only survived, but persisted and evolved. As the late Precambrian drew to a close, Earth's oceans and atmosphere reached a dynamic equilibrium that had eluded the planet for much of its early history. Oxygen, once scarce and unevenly distributed, now permeated shallow seas and gradually diffused into deeper layers. This increasing availability allowed aerobic organisms to expand their activity, metabolize more efficiently, and occupy previously uninhabitable zones. Carbon and nitrogen cycles stabilized as well, with photosynthetic production and microbial decomposition maintaining a balance that supported consistent nutrient availability. The interplay between these cycles and physical processes such as ocean currents, tides, and glacial meltwater ensured that ecological resources were replenished predictably, fostering the persistence and diversification of life. Shallow continental shelves became hotspots of productivity. Sunlight penetrated these waters, supporting the continued growth of photosynthetic microorganisms and simple multicellular colonies. Nutrients carried by rivers, glacial runoff, and ocean currents sustained dense populations, creating an intricate web of interactions among species. Predation may have been minimal at this stage, but competition for space, light, and chemical resources was intense, driving selective pressures that favored organisms with enhanced adaptability. These pressures refined metabolic efficiency, structural organization, and reproductive strategies, preparing life for the broader ecological expansions that would follow. Deeper ocean layers retained pockets of anaerobic life, forming a complementary biosphere that preserved ancient metabolic pathways. Microbial communities in these zones contributed to sediment chemistry, recycling essential elements and maintaining gradients that influenced the distribution of aerobic organisms above. Hydrothermal vent systems continued to provide stable refuges rich in chemical energy, allowing isolated populations to persist despite fluctuations in surface conditions. In these extreme environments, life maintained continuity, a bridge between the harsh eras of near extinction and the emerging complexity of multicellular ecosystems. The chemical interaction between oceans and atmosphere further reinforced ecological stability. Oxygenation of surface waters influenced carbonate deposition, altering sediment composition and affecting the long-term storage of carbon. Photosynthetic activity regulated atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, indirectly moderating global temperatures and contributing to the moderation of glacial cycles. Volcanic outgassing added episodic pulses of greenhouse gases and minerals, sustaining productivity and creating localized bursts of environmental change that organisms could exploit. This intricate network of chemical feedbacks created a planet in which life was no longer merely responding to extremes, but actively shaping the conditions that permitted its survival. Ecosystem structure matured in response to these stabilizing forces. Microbial mats displayed layered organization, facilitating efficient resource capture and protection from environmental stressors. Multicellular colonies developed rudimentary forms of tissue differentiation, enhancing structural integrity and resource utilization. Life was increasingly spatially organized, with dense communities in productive shallow seas and isolated populations in deeper or chemically distinct zones. This distribution provided resilience. If one habitat experienced disruption, other refuges could maintain genetic diversity and recolonize affected areas, reducing the risk of global extinction. By the end of the late Precambrian, the Earth had transitioned from a planet on the verge of lifelessness to a resilient and interconnected biosphere. Life had endured repeated glaciations, anoxic conditions, chemical fluctuations, and tectonic upheavals, adapting through metabolic flexibility, habitat specialization, and ecological innovation. The survival and gradual expansion of microbial and simple multicellular life created a foundation capable of supporting greater diversity. The oceans, atmosphere, and continents were no longer simply backdrops for survival. They were integral components of a system in which biological, chemical, and physical processes were inseparably linked, ensuring the persistence of life through time. This culmination of biological and environmental stabilization illustrates the profound resilience of life. Even after billions of years of extreme conditions that threatened to render the planet barren, the combination of adaptation, ecological organization, and planetary feedback loops allowed Earth to emerge as a habitable world. Life's persistence was not a sudden triumph, but the product of continuous, incremental survival across countless generations and varied habitats. Each microbial mat, each early multicellular colony, and each chemical feedback mechanism contributed to the enduring presence of life on a planet that had once teetered on the brink of complete lifelessness. As we look back across these vast spans of time, the persistence of life emerges not as a single story of triumph, but as a tapestry of adaptation, interaction, and recovery. The Earth, in its formative eons, faced conditions that could have extinguished every organism. Oceans frozen from pole to equator, atmospheres depleted or suffused with toxic gases, and landscapes reshaped violently by volcanic eruptions and tectonic upheaval. Yet in the shadows of these extremes, life persisted in the smallest and most secluded refuges, in pockets of warmth, nutrient, and chemical balance, quietly enduring while the surface world remained inhospitable. The patterns of survival reveal a delicate interplay between the living and the non-living. Microorganisms transformed their environment even as they were constrained by it. Cyanobacteria produced oxygen that gradually altered ocean and atmospheric chemistry, enabling aerobic life to expand. Hydrothermal vent communities preserved ancient metabolic pathways, acting as reservoirs of continuity during global glaciations. Multicellular colonies exploited the shifting balance of nutrients and light, stabilizing localized ecosystems that would support further evolutionary experimentation. Life was never isolated from its surroundings. It was a participant in a planetary scale feedback loop, shaping and being shaped by chemistry, geology, and climate. Ocean currents, sediment flows, and atmospheric composition interacted in ways that magnified or mitigated the extremes of climate. Volcanic emissions occasionally introduced bursts of warmth or chemical enrichment, while the retreat of glaciers allowed shallow seas to expand, creating temporary havens for microbial and multicellular populations. Even the seemingly minor gradients of oxygen, sulfur, and iron within stratified oceans had profound consequences for which lineages survived and which disappeared. Life's resilience depended on a precise alignment of these factors, and yet the outcomes were never predetermined, highlighting the precariousness of habitability during these formative eons. The late Precambrian world, emerging from cycles of near-total glaciation and chemical instability, demonstrates the persistence of life through continuous adaptation. Organisms that could tolerate fluctuating oxygen levels variable temperatures, and intermittent nutrient availability became the foundation for future ecosystems. These survivors seeded the oceans with genetic and metabolic diversity, ensuring that subsequent evolutionary developments would have the raw material needed to thrive. Without these incremental successes, the later explosion of life in the Cambrian would have been impossible. The story of life during these extreme periods also underscores the importance of spatial and ecological refuges. Hydrothermal vents, protected lagoons, and shallow continental shelves served as safe havens where life could maintain continuity, experiment with new metabolic strategies, and gradually expand into adjacent habitats. Even small, isolated populations contributed disproportionately to the persistence of global biodiversity. Life survival was less about abundance and more about resilience, about the capacity to endure, adapt, and recolonize in a world of relentless environmental change. In contemplating this era, it becomes evident that Earth's history is marked not only by the fragility of life, but also by its capacity for recovery. The near-lifeless periods of the planet's past were intervals of extreme selection, filtering life through conditions of intense pressure and scarcity. Yet these periods also fostered innovation, the evolution of eukaryotic cells, the emergence of multicellularity, and the organization of complex microbial communities were all products of survival under adversity. Life's trajectory during the late Precambrian demonstrates that even the harshest environmental constraints can drive the emergence of new forms, behaviors, and structures capable of shaping the future of ecosystems. As we reflect quietly, the interplay of ice, chemical cycles, geological upheaval, and biological ingenuity creates a narrative of persistence that is both scientific and profoundly meditative. Each microbial mat, each multicellular colony, and each environmental feedback contributed to a story of enduring life on a planet that had, more than once, approached lifelessness. The resilience of Earth's biosphere reminds us that survival is never the result of a single factor, but the outcome of countless interactions over immense spans of time, a delicate balance maintained through persistence, adaptation, and the subtle orchestration of planetary systems. Beneath the surface of these late Precambrian oceans, a quiet persistence unfolded. Microbial colonies, layered mats, and simple multicellular forms continued their slow, methodical work of sustaining life through chemical and physical challenges. Oxygenation pulses, minor volcanic events, and shifts in ocean circulation each created subtle opportunities and threats. Life responded in measured ways. Some lineages adapted to exploit rising oxygen levels, others found niches in low oxygen waters, and still others colonized sediments enriched by mineral runoff. Each adaptive response, though minute on human timescales, accumulated over millions of years into a robust tapestry of ecological continuity. Geology and biology remained entwined. Continental drift-shaped coastlines, determining where shallow seas would form and which regions would experience the greatest influx of nutrients from erosion and glacial meltwater. Volcanic emissions supplied both warmth and essential minerals, catalyzing localized productivity while occasionally challenging organisms with toxic byproducts. Sedimentation and chemical precipitation in shallow basins created substrates upon which microbial mats and multicellular colonies could anchor and expand. Life was both sculpted by and sculptor of its environment, creating a dynamic interdependence that balanced fragility with resilience. The oceans themselves became arenas of selective pressure and innovation. Stratification created gradients of oxygen, sulfur, and nutrients that favored organisms capable of metabolic flexibility. Shallow illuminated zones encouraged photosynthetic activity, while deeper, anoxic layers preserved archaic metabolic strategies. Interactions between these zones allowed genetic exchange, promoting diversity even across habitats that appeared isolated. In this way, the planet nurtured both continuity and variation, ensuring that life could persist through localized catastrophes while maintaining a pool of potential innovations for future expansion. As the chemical and ecological environment stabilized, multicellular colonies refined their organization. Some began forming simple, tissue-like arrangements, providing structural support and improved nutrient distribution within colonies. Coordination among cells allowed colonies to occupy habitats more efficiently, stabilizing populations and enhancing reproductive success. These structural and functional improvements reflected not only biological ingenuity, but also the subtle shaping influence of environmental constraints. In essence, life adapted not in isolation, but as a response to the persistent pressures and opportunities presented by a planet slowly recovering from near lifelessness. Atmospheric oxygen continued its gradual rise, providing the energetic foundation for larger and more complex organisms. Photosynthetic activity maintained balance in carbon dioxide levels, while nutrient recycling in sediments and shallow seas ensured that food webs remained continuous. The combination of chemical stability, predictable habitats, and ecological diversity created conditions in which life could experiment with new forms without the immediate threat of extinction. In these final stages before the Cambrian, life had transitioned from mere survival to active shaping of its environment, influencing climate, chemical cycles, and sediment composition in ways that reinforced its own persistence. Reflecting on this era, one sees the remarkable subtlety with which life navigated a precarious world. Extreme glaciations, volatile chemical cycles, and tectonic upheavals repeatedly tested the limits of survival. Yet the biosphere endured through adaptability, localized refuges, and gradual environmental stabilization. Microbial mats, hydrothermal vent communities, and early multicellular colonies each played a critical role in preserving diversity, sustaining chemical cycles, and expanding ecological possibilities. The interplay between biological innovation and planetary processes ensured that the thread of life, once fragile, persisted across immense spans of time. The story of Earth's near-lifeless periods offers a lesson in patience and resilience. Life did not rebound in sudden leaps, but through continuous, incremental responses to environmental pressures. Each organism, each chemical cycle, and each geological adjustment contributed to a slow but inexorable recovery. Habitats expanded cautiously, populations stabilized, and ecosystems gradually became more interconnected. The late Precambrian biosphere exemplifies a planet on the verge of transformation, a living system that endured adversity not through strength alone, but through the persistent, adaptive interplay of countless interacting factors across millions of years. Across the late Precambrian landscape, the subtle orchestration of chemical cycles maintained the conditions that allowed life to endure. Oxygen produced by photosynthetic organisms gradually permeated shallow seas, while carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles stabilized through microbial metabolism and sedimentary processes. These cycles were neither uniform nor constant, yet their fluctuating patterns created pockets of habitability across the oceans. Nutrient-rich zones supported dense microbial and multicellular communities, while less hospitable regions preserved anaerobic populations that maintained ancient metabolic pathways. This mosaic of habitats ensured that even local environmental disturbances did not threaten the survival of life on a planetary scale. Ocean stratification remained a defining feature of these ecosystems. Surface waters exposed to sunlight and moderate oxygen levels supported organisms that relied on photosynthesis and aerobic respiration. Beneath these layers, anoxic or hypoxic waters preserved archaic microbes, forming a hidden biosphere that contributed to nutrient recycling and chemical stability. The interaction between these layers, along with the periodic influx of minerals from glacial melt and volcanic activity, created gradients that encouraged metabolic diversity. Life's resilience depended on the capacity to exploit these gradients, to move between layers, or to tolerate variations in chemical composition and temperature. Refugees continued to play a crucial role in the persistence of life. Shallow lagoons, hydrothermal vent systems, and protected continental shelves acted as stable reservoirs of biological diversity, even as ice sheets advanced or retreated, as volcanic eruptions altered chemical balances. These refugees allowed populations to endure, recover, and recolonize affected regions. They functioned as both safe havens and evolutionary incubators, where metabolic pathways could be refined, symbiotic relationships established, and structural complexity enhanced. The existence of these refugees highlights how spatial heterogeneity and localized stability were critical for survival during periods of extreme environmental fluctuation. The stabilization of atmospheric and oceanic chemistry enabled multicellular colonies to expand their structural and functional sophistication. Some colonies developed rudimentary tissue differentiation, enhancing nutrient distribution, internal support, and overall resilience. Coordinated cell activity allowed colonies to thrive in varying conditions, from sunlit shallow waters to deeper, chemically stratified regions. Life's ability to influence its environment, oxygenating water, altering sediment composition, and recycling nutrients, illustrates a growing feedback loop between biology and planetary processes. The biosphere was no longer solely at the mercy of external forces. It had become an active participant in shaping conditions favorable to survival and diversification. As these processes continued, Earth's biosphere increasingly displayed signs of ecological integration. Nutrient and energy flows connected shallow seas, continental margins, and hydrothermal vent communities. Localized adaptations, such as metabolic flexibility and tissue-like organization in colonies, contributed to broader ecological stability. Microbial mats regulated oxygen availability in surface waters, while anaerobic communities preserved metabolic diversity in deeper layers. This balance of specialization and continuity allowed life to navigate environmental extremes with remarkable efficiency, maintaining a planet-wide network of interdependent ecosystems. Reflecting on these developments, the late Precambrian emerges as a period of careful, incremental recovery. Life had weathered cycles of extreme glaciation, chemical volatility, and tectonic upheaval. Through adaptation, habitat specialization, and continuous interaction with the geochemical environment, organisms preserved diversity, expanded ecological niches, and gradually increased complexity. The stage was now set for the Cambrian explosion, a period in which multicellular life would diversify dramatically, building upon the resilient foundation established over millions of years. The near-lifeless world had become a carefully balanced biosphere, a testament to the persistent ingenuity of life in the face of planetary adversity. Oceans rippled under an ever-changing sky, carrying dissolved oxygen and nutrients from one shallow shelf to another. Microbial mats spread over sedimented basins, their layered structures regulating local chemistry, producing oxygen in pockets where light penetrated just enough to sustain photosynthesis. Below these mats, anaerobic microbes maintained chemical gradients, cycling sulfur and nitrogen, sustaining the stability of the sediments. The currents moved these chemicals across distances, subtly linking isolated habitats. Hydrothermal vents emitted steady warmth and mineral-rich plumes, supporting communities that had remained virtually unchanged for eons, acting as anchors in a landscape of constant fluctuation. Colonies of simple multicellular organisms occupied these nutrient-rich zones. Their cells specialized in absorption, structure, or movement. Some adhered to substrates in shallow bays, while others floated in colonies suspended in water columns. Their spatial arrangements allowed efficient resource use and a degree of protection from currents or sediment shifts. Interactions between these colonies and microbial mats created localized feedback loops. Oxygen produced by photosynthesis facilitated aerobic respiration in neighboring colonies, while decomposition released nutrients that stimulated further growth. Small variations in temperature or chemical composition could shift which organisms dominated particular zones, creating a constantly evolving patchwork across the late Precambrian seas. The chemistry of water reflected this interplay. Surface layers had increasing oxygenation, though pockets of hypoxia persisted in protected basins. Iron and phosphorus cycles responded to sedimentation and runoff from glacial meltwater, occasionally triggering localized blooms of microbial or multicellular life. Methane and carbon dioxide from volcanic outgassing warmed parts of the oceans, accelerating metabolic processes and nutrient circulation. These interactions created gradients of energy and resources, and life exploited every niche, moving between layers or colonizing transient habitats created by shifting currents or temporary exposure of shallow areas. Geological changes reshaped the context in which these ecosystems operated. Shifting continental fragments formed new shallow seas and bays, providing temporary havens from extreme temperatures and chemical stresses. Erosion delivered minerals to the oceans, while tides and currents distributed them unevenly, forming chemical mosaics across regions. Life adapted to exploit these mosaics, with colonies growing larger in nutrient-rich areas and retracting or dispersing in depleted zones. Even small variations, slightly warmer water, a new inflow of minerals, a subtle change in salinity could alter competitive dynamics, reinforcing the continual adaptability of these communities. Through this complex network of interactions, multicellular organisms began to exhibit rudimentary coordination across cells, forming structural patterns that enhanced survival. Nutrient absorption became more efficient, as inner cells were supported by outer layers, and the positioning of colonies allowed for optimal exposure to light and chemical gradients. The surrounding microbial communities continued to modulate chemical conditions, maintaining gradients of oxygen and nutrients that favored aerobic activity and overall ecological stability. Hydrothermal vent systems continued to provide isolated refuges, ensuring that ancestral metabolic diversity was preserved, while newly oxygenated shallow seas became centers of gradual ecological expansion. By this stage, life occupied a planet where nearly every habitable niche had been explored or partially colonized. Microbes, simple multicellular colonies, and stratified ecosystems intertwined, producing a dynamic but stable biosphere. Oxygenation, nutrient cycles, sedimentation, and chemical stratification formed a complex environmental web, linking biological innovation to geological and chemical processes. Survival was no longer a matter of enduring extremes in isolation. It depended on occupying, maintaining, and responding to a continuously shifting network of interdependent habitats, each influencing the others through subtle, persistent feedbacks. Shallow, continental shelves teemed with colonies that had begun to exhibit more consistent structural organization. Cells within these colonies arranged themselves to maximize surface area for light capture and nutrient absorption, forming layered structures that balanced exposure to sunlight with access to waterborne resources. The positioning of colonies within currents allowed them to capture nutrients delivered from distant regions while remaining anchored in stable sediment, a delicate balance that ensured persistence across seasons and fluctuating chemical conditions. Nearby microbial mats adjusted the local oxygen and nutrient levels, creating microenvironments in which multicellular colonies could thrive. Deeper waters retained pockets of slower-growing microbial communities, stratified in layers corresponding to oxygen, sulfur, and nutrient gradients. These layers acted as a stabilizing backbone for the broader oceanic ecosystem, cycling essential elements and maintaining chemical diversity. When surface conditions became temporarily inhospitable due to glacial melt, volcanic emissions, or minor shifts in ocean currents, these deeper communities provided continuity, releasing nutrients gradually and supporting recolonization in the upper layers. Life had created a system where persistence depended on a network of interlinked habitats, each contributing to the resilience of the whole biosphere. Currents and tides redistributed planktonic forms and free-floating colonies, connecting distant shallow seas and allowing genetic material to spread across regions. Colonies that had adapted to slightly higher oxygen levels or more variable temperatures gradually colonized new areas as environmental conditions shifted. These dispersal events were subtle and slow, but over thousands of years, they allowed populations to mix, exchange metabolic adaptations, and refine structural organization. Even minor differences in chemical composition, such as localized increases in phosphorus or nitrogen, could stimulate localized growth, reinforcing the patchwork of habitable zones across continental margins. Hydrothermal vent communities continued to act as isolated reservoirs of metabolic diversity. The chemical energy supplied by vent fluids allowed organisms to survive independently of sunlight, maintaining lineages that had persisted through glacial extremes and chemical fluctuations. These isolated habitats served as sources of resilience, preserving ancestral metabolic pathways that could recolonize or influence other areas as conditions permitted. The interplay between these vent communities and surface ecosystems added an additional layer of stability to the overall biosphere, ensuring that life could persist even during episodic environmental upheavals. Sediment chemistry and nutrient recycling in the late Precambrian were tightly linked to these biological processes. As microbial mats and multicellular colonies decomposed or released metabolic byproducts, elements such as carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and iron were redistributed through the water column and into sediments. This continuous cycling maintained the chemical gradients necessary for diverse metabolic strategies, reinforced ecological niches, and stabilized oxygen availability. Life, in effect, became a driver of planetary chemistry, modulating conditions to create a more habitable environment while simultaneously responding to ongoing fluctuations. Across these seas and basins, life had reached a level of structural, chemical, and spatial integration that allowed sustained persistence. Colonies, mats, and vent communities were no longer isolated actors, but part of a complex, interdependent network. Fluctuations in one area could ripple through the system, yet the diversity of habitats and the flexibility of life forms ensured resilience. The late Precambrian biosphere, once precarious and fragmented, had become a continuously functioning system, capable of sustaining the metabolic, structural, and ecological innovations that would lead directly into the Cambrian expansion. Shallow seas continued to host expanding colonies, each adjusting subtly to local gradients of light, oxygen, and nutrients. Colonies increased their surface area through branching and layering, allowing more efficient capture of sunlight and dissolved compounds. Cells within these structures specialize further, with some devoted to structural support and others to metabolic activity. These arrangements improved resilience against sediment shifts and minor fluctuations in currents, while facilitating localized nutrient cycling. Microbial mats beneath and around these colonies maintained chemical balance, releasing phosphorus and nitrogen gradually and sustaining aerobic activity in overlying layers. Deeper water zones retained slow-growing microbial assemblages, their metabolism tuned to low oxygen and high sulfur environments. These assemblages acted as chemical buffers, stabilizing the sediments and maintaining a repository of metabolic diversity. Elements cycled through these layers, supporting surface populations indirectly, linking deep and shallow ecosystems through dissolved nutrients and chemical gradients. Such vertical integration of habitats allowed life to endure minor climatic or volcanic disruptions, as one layer could compensate for stress in another, reinforcing the overall resilience of the biosphere. The currents distributed microscopic life across distances, enabling colonies and planktonic forms to disperse to new regions of suitable habitat. Populations that established in slightly different chemical or thermal conditions accumulated distinct adaptations. Over extended periods, these small differences in metabolism, structure, and growth patterns contributed to the genetic and functional diversity of the biosphere. Even subtle variations in mineral content from glacial runoff or volcanic activity produced localized blooms, reinforcing the mosaic of ecosystems across continental shelves and shallow basins. Hydrothermal vents continued to function as refuges and laboratories of metabolic stability. The chemical energy emitted allowed specialized communities to persist independently of sunlight, while gradients of temperature and mineral availability encouraged unique metabolic pathways. These populations isolated yet resilient, periodically influenced surrounding shallow waters through dispersal or the release of chemical byproducts, subtly integrating the most extreme habitats with the broader biosphere. The continuity maintained in these vents ensured that ancient metabolic innovations were preserved, ready to be incorporated into evolving multicellular ecosystems as environmental conditions allowed. The recycling of nutrients in sediments and water columns remained a central mechanism of ecological stability. Decomposing colonies, microbial exudates, and chemical precipitation maintained gradients of carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and iron, essential for diverse metabolic strategies. This cycling not only sustained life, but also reinforced the gradual oxygenation of surface waters, supporting aerobic organisms and allowing multicellular colonies to maintain more complex structures. Life and chemistry became increasingly interdependent, each influencing the other in subtle, continuous feedback loops that stabilized habitats over millennia. By this stage, the late Precambrian oceans had become highly organized systems. Microbial mats, multicellular colonies, and hydrothermal vent communities formed an interlinked network spanning depth, geography, and chemical conditions. Structural and functional innovations within colonies, coupled with chemical and nutrient gradients maintained across habitats, allowed life to persist through environmental variability. The biosphere had shifted from a precarious collection of isolated survivors into a robust, integrated system capable of sustaining complexity and preparing for the broader diversification of life that would define the Cambrian period. In the shallow shelves, colonies refined their arrangements, balancing exposure to sunlight with the flow of nutrients and oxygen. Some began forming more cohesive structures that maintained internal chemical gradients, allowing inner cells to survive even when external conditions fluctuated. Outer layers protected delicate internal cells, while metabolic waste products circulated slowly, sustaining both the colony itself and the surrounding microbial community. These structural refinements allowed colonies to occupy more exposed areas without succumbing to currents, sediment shifts, or minor temperature variations, gradually expanding the habitable zones along continental margins. Deeper basins continued to harbor stable microbial communities where chemical stratification supported metabolic diversity. Sulfur-reducing and iron-oxidizing microbes maintained sediments rich in essential elements, while anaerobic metabolism in low-oxygen zones preserved ancient lineages. These deep populations acted as repositories of biochemical knowledge, providing resilience to the biosphere by maintaining diversity in isolation. Occasional dispersal of microbes from these zones into more oxygenated waters contributed incremental innovations, subtly influencing surface ecosystems and expanding metabolic options for multicellular colonies. Currents, tides, and glacial meltwater transported organisms and dissolved nutrients across regions, linking previously disconnected habitats. Populations adapted to slightly differing chemical or thermal conditions gradually spread, allowing genetic and functional traits to propagate throughout the oceans. Localized variations in nutrient availability or chemical composition produce small but persistent shifts in colony growth patterns, reinforcing the mosaic of ecological niches. Each interaction, each subtle chemical gradient, and each movement of water or organism contributed to a network that was both stable and flexible, capable of maintaining life even under periodic stress. Hydrothermal vent systems remained critical nodes of persistence. Their constant supply of heat and minerals supported communities capable of surviving independently of surface light. The vents acted as metabolic reservoirs, where ancient biochemical strategies were preserved and occasionally introduced into shallower habitats through dispersal or chemical diffusion. This interplay between isolated, stable refuges and dynamic surface ecosystems strengthened global ecological stability, creating a biosphere in which both continuity and innovation were maintained across time and space. Sediment and water column processes continued to circulate essential elements, reinforcing oxygenation of surface layers and sustaining multicellular colonies. Microbial decomposition, chemical precipitation, and nutrient recycling maintained gradients of carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and iron, each element contributing to metabolic diversity. These cycles supported colonies that could exploit environmental fluctuations without collapsing, ensuring a balance between metabolic innovation and ecological persistence. Life had evolved not only to survive extremes, but to integrate fully with planetary processes, stabilizing the chemical and physical environment that sustained it. Across these interconnected habitats, the biosphere had achieved a level of cohesion previously absent. Colonies, microbial mats, and vent communities were interdependent, forming networks that spanned depth, geography, and chemical conditions. Structural refinements in multicellular colonies, metabolic specialization, and nutrient cycling coalesced into a resilient planetary system. By the end of the late Precambrian, life had transitioned from fragile survivors into a self-reinforcing biosphere, prepared for the sudden proliferation of diversity that would define the Cambrian. The Earth, once teetering on the edge of lifelessness, now maintained a subtle, enduring rhythm, with every organism, current, and chemical gradient contributing to a balance that allowed life to flourish on a planetary scale. In the shallow waters, multicellular colonies adjusted subtly to gradients of light and nutrient availability. Branching structures allowed some cells to capture sunlight, while others processed dissolved nutrients from surrounding waters. The colony's internal flows distributed chemical byproducts slowly, ensuring that inner cells could maintain metabolism even when currents or sediment deposition fluctuated. Surrounding microbial mats absorbed excess oxygen and nutrients, stabilizing the immediate environment and creating microhabitats where colonies could persist over long timescales. Each small adjustment in structure or positioning allowed colonies to extend their reach into previously marginal areas, gradually expanding the habitable zone across continental shelves. In mid-depth regions, communities of planktonic microbes circulated with currents, connecting disparate shallow habitats. These organisms carried genetic material and metabolic traits from one region to another, facilitating incremental adaptation across broad geographic areas. Small differences in chemical composition, phosphorus or iron concentrations, variations in oxygen saturation, prompted localized shifts in growth and reproduction, producing a dynamic mosaic of productivity and diversity. Over thousands of years, these subtle variations produced a network of interdependent populations that linked shallow colonies, mid-water microbial communities, and deeper basins, reinforcing the overall stability of the biosphere. Hydrothermal vents continued to serve as isolated reservoirs of resilience. Their constant emission of heat and minerals maintained populations capable of surviving independently of surface conditions. These communities preserved metabolic strategies that had endured through repeated glaciations, chemical shifts, and tectonic disturbances. Occasionally, dispersal events introduced organisms or chemical byproducts from vent ecosystems into more oxygenated zones, subtly influencing surface colonies and microbial mats. This slow, incremental integration of isolated refugees with broader ecosystems provided a stabilizing influence, ensuring that even extreme environmental perturbations could be mitigated across the planetary biosphere. Sediment and water column processes reinforced this stability. Decomposition of organic matter, precipitation of minerals, and slow nutrient recycling maintained gradients of carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and iron. These gradients regulated the distribution of microbial and multicellular populations, supporting both aerobic and anaerobic metabolism. Small changes in local chemistry could shift the balance of communities, but the overall system absorbed these fluctuations, with interconnected habitats providing redundancy and continuity. Life had become a participant in planetary processes, modulating the environment while simultaneously adapting to it, creating a feedback loop that strengthened resilience over geological timescales. Across all depths and regions, the late Precambrian biosphere was increasingly integrated. Microbial mats, multicellular colonies, and vent communities formed a continuous network of interdependent habitats. Structural and functional refinements within colonies, along with chemical and nutrient cycling, allowed life to exploit subtle variations in the environment while maintaining overall stability. Surface and deep layers were linked through nutrient flows and dispersal, while isolated refuges contributed ancestral metabolic strategies. The result was a biosphere capable of sustaining complexity, preserving diversity, and navigating environmental extremes with a stability that had been absent in previous eons. Even in areas subjected to glacial advance or chemical fluctuation, life persisted. Shallow shelves and continental margins recovered more quickly due to higher nutrient availability and light penetration, while deep basins and vents acted as stabilizing reservoirs. Colonies adjusted their growth patterns. Microbial mats redistributed nutrients, and currents carried both organisms and chemical compounds across distances. Life, in its multitude of forms, had reached a level of planetary integration where survival depended not on any single habitat, but on the continuous interplay between diverse ecosystems, subtle chemical gradients, and structural refinements that had evolved over millions of years. Colonies in the shallow seas continued to refine their growth patterns, expanding laterally and vertically to exploit light and nutrient gradients efficiently. Branching and layering allowed inner cells to remain metabolically active even as surface cells absorbed sunlight and processed surrounding compounds. Microbial mats beneath and around these colonies modulated oxygen and nutrient levels, stabilizing the immediate environment and facilitating slow chemical exchange with the water column. Currents carried minute particles and dissolved nutrients, connecting distant colonies and ensuring that localized productivity contributed to broader ecological networks. Planktonic microbes and floating multicellular forms dispersed across mid-depth waters, linking habitats separated by kilometers of ocean. Genetic material and metabolic innovations spread incrementally through these dispersal events, subtly shaping populations in both shallow and deeper zones. Local variations in oxygen, phosphorus, nitrogen, or iron created a patchwork of microhabitats where small differences could influence growth rates and reproductive success. Over millennia, these variations reinforced resilience, producing an interconnected biosphere capable of responding adaptively to environmental fluctuations. Hydrothermal vent communities maintain their role as reservoirs of ancient metabolic diversity. Constant warmth and mineral flux supported populations independent of sunlight, preserving biochemical strategies that had persisted through extreme glaciations and chemical upheavals. Occasional dispersal of microbes or chemical byproducts from these vents into oxygenated regions introduced incremental innovation, supporting colonies and microbial mats in surface and mid-depth habitats. This subtle integration of isolated refugees into the broader ecosystem contributed to global stability, reinforcing both continuity and evolutionary potential. Sediment and water, column nutrient cycling, continued to maintain gradients essential for life. Decomposition, mineral precipitation, and slow recycling of carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and iron allowed both aerobic and anaerobic populations to thrive. Colonies adjusted growth patterns in response to local chemical fluctuations, while microbial mats absorbed excess nutrients and moderated oxygen levels. Currents and tides transported dissolved elements across regions, linking habitats and supporting a global network of interdependent ecosystems. Each layer, colony, and chemical gradient contributed to the overall resilience of the biosphere, ensuring survival across vast timescales. By this stage, the late Precambrian oceans formed a coherent system of interdependent habitats. Colonies, microbial mats, planktonic populations, and hydrothermal vent communities functioned as an integrated network with nutrient and chemical flows connecting shallow, mid-depth, and deep environments. Structural refinements within colonies, metabolic specialization, and nutrient cycling coalesced into a planetary-scale biosphere capable of sustaining complexity. Surface and deep layers, isolated refuges, and connected shelves were interwoven in a system that absorbed environmental perturbations, maintained diversity, and supported incremental evolutionary innovation. Across continental margins and shallow seas, colonies expanded into previously marginal areas, exploiting small variations in light and nutrient availability. Microbial mats adapted continuously, maintaining local chemical balance and moderating oxygen levels. Planktonic forms distributed metabolic innovations, linking disparate populations. Hydrothermal vents preserved ancestral biochemical strategies, feeding subtle influences into surface ecosystems. Currents, tides, and chemical gradients formed an intricate web in which every organism, every flow of nutrients, and every subtle change in habitat contributed to the long-term persistence of life. The biosphere, once fragile and scattered, had become a continuous, dynamic, and resilient system, capable of weathering environmental extremes while maintaining the potential for future complexity. Colonies in the shallow shelves continued to adjust to shifting conditions, expanding toward regions of higher light penetration while retreating slightly in areas affected by sediment accumulation or minor chemical changes. Their cells formed delicate but resilient arrangements, with outer layers shielding inner metabolic zones and facilitating nutrient exchange with surrounding microbial mats. These mats absorbed excess oxygen, recycled chemical byproducts, and regulated local conditions, creating microenvironments that allowed colonies to thrive steadily even when external conditions fluctuated. The interplay between structure and chemistry became increasingly sophisticated, with small adjustments producing measurable improvements in survival and reproductive efficiency. Floating multicellular forms and planktonic microbes maintained connectivity across mid-depth waters, carrying metabolic innovations and genetic variations from one colony cluster to another. Subtle differences in dissolved minerals, oxygen saturation, or nutrient composition created microhabitat diversity, allowing different populations to dominate in localized areas while maintaining links across the larger biosphere. Over thousands of years, these processes allowed life to maintain stability in the face of environmental fluctuations, while also promoting slow evolutionary experimentation within interconnected habitats. Each dispersal event, no matter how small, reinforced resilience and enabled life to adapt incrementally to a changing planet. Hydrothermal vents, largely isolated from the dynamic surface environment, continued to provide stable refuges. Communities within these vents relied on chemical energy, preserving ancient metabolic pathways that had persisted through cycles of glaciation and chemical instability. Occasionally, vent-derived organisms or dissolved compounds dispersed into shallower waters, contributing small but significant influences on nutrient cycles and population dynamics. These interactions, though subtle, reinforced the interdependence of life across depths, creating redundancy and stability within the global biosphere. Life in surface and deep habitats remained linked, with feedbacks sustaining chemical gradients and population diversity across the planet. Sediment and water column processes continued to mediate nutrient cycling, linking oxygenated surface waters with hypoxic and anoxic layers below. Decomposition and mineral precipitation redistributed essential elements such as carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and iron, sustaining both aerobic and anaerobic populations. Colonies adjusted their internal organization in response to minor chemical fluctuations, while microbial mats modulated local conditions, maintaining stable environments over long timescales. Currents and tides transported nutrients and organisms between regions, creating continuity across distant habitats. Each layer, colony, and microbial community contributed to the persistence of life and the resilience of the biosphere as a whole. The interconnected late Precambrian biosphere now resembled a complex adaptive network. Colonies, microbial mats, planktonic populations, and hydrothermal vent communities formed an integrated system spanning surface shelves, mid-depth waters, and deep basins. Structural refinements, metabolic specialization, and nutrient cycling coalesced into a global-scale system capable of sustaining complexity, preserving diversity, and absorbing environmental fluctuations. Feedback loops between life and planetary processes ensured that oxygenation, chemical gradients, and habitat stability were maintained, allowing life to persist and gradually expand. Across this network, small incremental changes in structure, dispersal, or chemical processing collectively strengthened the resilience of the entire biosphere, preparing the planet for the next phase of biological evolution. Colonies across shallow seas adjusted their forms in response to subtle shifts in light, current, and nutrient flow. Branching structures extended toward areas with optimal sunlight, while internal channels circulated metabolic byproducts, supporting cells deep within the colony. Microbial mats beneath and around these colonies moderated oxygen and nutrient levels, absorbing excess and releasing essential compounds gradually, creating stable microenvironments. Even slight changes in local currents or sediment deposition prompted colonies to reorganize their structure incrementally, maintaining persistence across dynamic conditions. In mid-depth waters, planktonic microbes and small multicellular forms continued dispersing, linking distant colonies and maintaining genetic and metabolic continuity. Nutrient gradients and chemical stratification shaped growth patterns, allowing localized populations to dominate while remaining part of a broader, interconnected network. Each dispersal event, each slight chemical shift, subtly influenced population dynamics, reinforcing the resilience of the biosphere. Over millennia, these small adjustments accumulated, strengthening interdependence between shallow, mid-depth, and deeper habitats. Hydrothermal vent communities continued to function as isolated repositories of metabolic diversity. The constant supply of heat and minerals sustained populations independent of sunlight, preserving ancient biochemical strategies. Gradual dispersal from vents introduced small innovations to surface ecosystems, influencing microbial mats and multicellular colonies in subtle ways. These contributions reinforced ecological continuity across habitats, ensuring that isolated pockets of stability could influence broader patterns of survival and adaptation. Life had created a system in which even the most extreme environments were connected indirectly to the global network. Sediment and water column processes maintained chemical gradients essential for life. Decomposition, mineral precipitation, and slow recycling of carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and iron regulated the distribution of microbial and multicellular populations. Colonies adjusted their internal and external structures in response to minor chemical fluctuations, while microbial mats moderated oxygen levels locally. Currents carried dissolved nutrients across distances, linking habitats and sustaining interdependent ecosystems. Each organism, gradient, and chemical cycle played a role in reinforcing resilience, ensuring the continuity of life across vast spatial and temporal scales. Across the late Precambrian biosphere, life had achieved remarkable integration. Colonies, mats, planktonic populations, and vent communities formed a dynamic network spanning shallow, mid-depth, and deep habitats. Structural refinements, metabolic specialization, dispersal, and nutrient cycling coalesced into a resilient planetary system. Surface and deep layers were linked through subtle feedbacks, and isolated refugees contributed ancestral metabolic strategies. The biosphere, once on the brink of lifelessness, had become a continuous, adaptive system capable of absorbing environmental fluctuations, maintaining diversity, and preparing the planet for the forthcoming expansion of complex life. Over the entire planet, subtle currents of water, nutrients, and chemical gradients maintained a delicate balance. Colonies in shallow seas, microbial mats in sediments, and vent communities in the deep interacted continuously, their combined activities regulating oxygen, recycling essential elements, and stabilizing habitats. Even the smallest dispersal events contributed to long-term resilience, linking populations and preserving metabolic diversity. Life had transformed Earth from near lifeless extremes into a quietly thriving, interconnected system. Across millions of years, the biosphere had grown steady, integrated, and capable of enduring fluctuations, setting the stage for the explosion of complexity that would soon follow.